All right, well, I want to welcome everyone to today's Forward in Energy Forum. Appreciate all of you joining both in the room here at the Wisconsin Energy Institute and online, wherever you are around the world. My name is Scott Williams. I'm the Research and Education Coordinator at the Wisconsin Energy Institute. And if this is your first time joining us and you're not familiar with the Wisconsin Energy Institute, our mission is to provide leadership on campus for multidisciplinary research, education, and outreach in a way that accelerates the world's transition to clean energy systems and solutions. So the Forward in Energy Forum is part of our efforts here at WI to cultivate public understanding of energy issues. This is a monthly series, both here in the room and online, that brings together experts both on and off campus with the goal of encouraging cross-disciplinary dialogue to explore the important technical, social, political, and economic dimensions of a wide variety of clean energy innovations and topics. And we'll continue to host in this hybrid format. We appreciate any feedback you have either in the room or online and how we can offer this in a way that's both useful and educational no matter how you're joined. So as we begin Native American Heritage Month today with our forum on the intersection of energy development and tribal activism, I want to first acknowledge that the land that UW-Madison and WI occupies is the ancestral home of the Ho-Chunk people, who have called this land Dejop since time immemorial. And we recognize and respect the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation and the 11 other First Nations that reside in the boundaries of the state of Wisconsin. And as we'll see in today's forum, tribal nations are often at the forefront of issues related to a clean and just energy transition. I also encourage you all to take part in Native November events here at UW-Madison. This year's theme is Beyond an Acknowledgement, which urges us to go beyond learning Indigenous history and recognizing current issues, celebrating successes, and committing to a better future. And you can see the URL is wis.edu/Native November. You can go to that website to learn all about the events happening in November on campus under that program. A few other announcements before we begin today's forum. First, I want to give another plug for our Propelling Women in Power podcast, which highlights the stories of women energy researchers here at the Wisconsin Energy Institute and the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center. It's a great series to hear about the successes and challenges of women energy researchers and advice they have for young women in STEM. The first season just wrapped up, but you can listen to all of the episodes so far and subscribe for future episodes by checking out the link. Go to wis.edu/pod or clicking on or using the QR code on the screen. And then our next forum this fall will be on Tuesday, November 29th at 4:30 p.m. And the title is Energy Career Pathways in Wisconsin. And we'll hear about efforts in the state to help students identify and pursue career opportunities in energy and learn more about energy job and training trends in Wisconsin. And finally, some logistical notes. We'll have opening remarks from our panelists, both in the room and online. We'll have them join in. And we'll have some Q&A with our moderator before taking audience questions. We'll try to alternate between questions in the room. So if you're in the room, just raise your hand. And then we also have Teresa or Austin or myself will also check the online questions. So we'll try to alternate between those two. And then if you are joining via Zoom, you can also turn on the live transcript to get live transcription. With that, I'll introduce today's moderator. Teresa Sarzheim is a postdoctoral research associate in water resources engineering here at the Wisconsin Energy Institute and the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies at UW-Madison. She's currently working with Professor Grace Poltail on the impacts of natural resource extraction on water quality on tribal lands. And more broadly, her research interests and experiences are at the intersection of science and engineering for agricultural and water resources management. And her research work is involved in analyzing climate change effects on the water, food, and energy nexus.
So much, Scott. I appreciate it. Welcome everyone joining us today in Zoom and online for this panel discussion. So I would like to start with a short opening on energy development, mainly liquid gas and oil lines on tribal lands, mainly in upper Midwest. You might have heard about the debates over Enbridge Line 3 and Line 5 and their social, environmental, and legal challenges for the engaged tribes. In general, the argument is that the fossil fuels infrastructure development has significant impacts on tribes, including the tribal land use changes, ecosystems degradation, water resources, and unsafety of tribal societies and members individually, which are mostly are not aligned with the tribe's interests. So today we have gathered to hear from the experts in these areas about the main issues and threats with this kind of energy development on the tribal lands and some possible solutions like transition to clean energy sources and the social activities and the lessons that.
We're getting some feedback. Some people are not able to hear very well. Try to, might just need to speak a little louder.
Okay. And social activities and lessons that we can learn envision the energy and environmental justice. So let me introduce our experts today. We are honored to have Dr. Sasha Suarez with us in the room. Sasha is Assistant Professor of History and American Indian Studies at UW-Madison. She is an interdisciplinary scholar of 20th century American, Indian, and indigenous histories with a special focus on the Great Lakes. She received her PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities in 2020, and her dissertation examines the gender practices of placemaking, community organizing, and activism on white Ojibwe in an urban environment. Her research interests include indigenous social movement and urban histories with the specificity of indigenous cultural, communal, and political continuity. As a white Earth Ojibwe descendant, Sasha has a great interest in how the construction of historical narratives are made accessible or inaccessible to her nation and urban indigenous. Next, we have Daniel Wiggins with us on the Zoom. Daniel is Tribal Energy Manager and Air Quality Technician in Bad River Natural Resources Department. He is a Bad River tribal member and has worked for the tribe for nearly 10 years as the air quality technician and has had oversight of the tribe's renewable energy activities since 2017. Daniel led tribal code development, specifically the review and adoption of utility codes on electrical transmission and energy products, and was recently tasked as the project lead for the Panik Navadide solar microgrid project. The tribe's energy projects are further planned and executed on the tribe's ability to exercise energy sovereignty and eventually reach the tribe's energy vision, which is to empower and enable the community to move towards energy independence. Welcome, Daniel. And finally, we have Kathleen Rosmer join us remotely. She has been the environmental program manager for the Sioux Saint Marie tribe of Chickasaw Indian since 2010. She began working there just 2 months before Enbridge Line 6 spilled 1.2 million gallons of tar sands oil into Talmadge Creek in southern Michigan. Her work fighting alongside tribal leadership to shut down Enbridge Line 5, a 66-year-old line that carries 23 million gallons per day along the shore of the Lake Michigan and across the state of Mackinac, has led her to protest governor's offices, media scrums, water ceremonies, and most recently into Michigan Tech, where she's working toward her PhD in energy and environmental policy. Thanks to Kathleen for joining us. So based on the format of the forum, each panelist is offered 2 minutes for some initial remarks. So let's start with Sasha and then we will
you. Bonjour, hello everyone. Try and be succinct here in my opening remarks. So as a historian who has been trained interdisciplinarily in American Studies and American Indian Studies, my work is really focused on looking at Indigenous resistance and thinking through the ways that Indigenous peoples perform activism, but also how Indigenous resistance exists in everyday life in a variety of different circumstances, particularly to threats that come with colonization. So as a direct descendant of the White Earth Band of Ojibwe, also Nation, these are conversations that are deeply impact our histories, particularly since White Earth did lose a tremendous amount of land through federal legislation and policy through allotment, which at White Earth was specifically designed to remove as much land as possible so extractive industries, particularly lumber companies, could access our lands. And I am constantly thinking about the interplay of Indigenous resistance, environment, and the lands, particularly within the Great Lakes, but within Ojibwe territories, particularly in the state of Minnesota. And I was going to start kind of talking about Line 3. However, as things go, as I'm sure you all know, there are so many different kinds of projects that are being proposed or worked on that the threats are kind of endless. So right before I arrived here, I actually got an email about donating to an organization who was seeking to continue the fight against the polymet sulfide mine in northeastern Minnesota, kind of in the Lake Superior watershed. And it just reminded me about the way that Indigenous peoples have been responding to environmental threats for a very long time. So Indigenous activism itself kind of presents itself through traditionally conceived of activism, direct action, on the ground work. But for Indigenous people, activism itself needs to be discussed with a broader understanding of resistance, which is the ways in which Indigenous peoples continually fight symptoms of colonization, which include land loss or destruction of traditional environments upon which Native people depend for the continuity of cultures, languages, and sovereignty itself. We can see Native nations kind of on a broad scale, nationally, activating around this issue for a number of decades. Particularly, things that might come to mind are uranium mining protests in the Southwest, or the battle that often led by Indigenous women is had around discussing water contamination across the country and also into Canada, particularly as it relates to fish, which then have impacts on people who rely upon fish as a main part of their diet. We also have this kind of even further historically. So at White Earth, for instance, those logging companies met a lot of resistance from Ojibwe people who specifically were looking to stop lumber companies from illegally harvesting trees on their own individual allotments, because companies would come in the middle of the night and take trees. So we have White Earth Ojibwe people lodging complaints and seeking some sort of justice from the Indian agent at White Earth for this kind of extraction. And of course, we have very contemporary examples such as Standing Rock in 2016, and of course, Line 3 in Minnesota as well. So I'd like to think about Indigenous resistance and activism in two different ways in relation to this topic of environmental activism. The first is how Indigenous peoples use ceremony to resist and to perform activism. And we see this very clearly in the Great Lakes with water walks, which are led by Anishinaabe women. And this has been happening since at least 2003, but draws upon much older practices and cultural understandings about Anishinaabe women's responsibilities to water. We also have kind of the ways in which tribal nations and their citizens and their descendants resist through public institutions, so public commissions, public hearings, legal systems, those kinds of methods. And then we of course have that direct action, which we see in Line 3 with direct creation of camps along the Lime Tree Replacement Corridor over the last few years. Of course, that ceasing last year when Lime Tree was finished operation. And we see camps, we see a number of organizations that are raising awareness, that are performing ceremony, having direct confrontation with law enforcement, which is often heavily militarized in these kinds of situations. And we also see the ways in which Indigenous peoples are building strong coalitional movements between Native and non-Native people around this issue of our shared environments and why it is important to protect them. I could go into a lot more detail, but I'm assuming that there will be plenty of time to do that in discussion. I'm going to stop.
So Daniel, would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you. Buju, Wabe Benesi, Indigenous Cause, Mako and Dundim, Mushkadibi and Dunjaba. My name is Daniel Wiggins. I'm coming to you from the Bad River Tribe, and I am the tribe's air quality technician. I'm also allowed to dabble, and we laugh. I get into renewable energy projects and energy projects overall within the tribe, and have been tasked with oversight of those energy projects since about 2017. As mentioned in my introduction, getting into energy projects, you always think, oh, I'm going to be putting up solar panels and be putting up wind turbines and all of that other fun stuff you guys see. And some of my first projects was actually around policy development. And so I actually helped the Bad River Tribe draft and adopt policies and codes specifically around the regulation of large-scale utilities, both that transport oil and gas, but that also are large electrical utilities. And so something that you wouldn't think tribes really have too many of, but you'd be surprised. I think each tribe really has some of these major corridors and these utilities to some extent. So it's very nice to see that tribes are really capable of taking back that authority and that regulation part of the puzzle, and providing that for its people. Kind of on the topic though, getting into what it is Dan does and how we respond to some of these activities is Bad River is fairly active in kind of pushing the clean energy initiative. And so that's something I've kind of taken pride into. It's something that I think if I was to take the renewable energy position again, it's something that I would look at the tribe and say, hey, where is your guys' key values at? What are you guys trying to do with clean energy and renewable energy in general? I think overall, you'll see a lot of municipalities, a lot of people approach energy projects differently, especially differently than tribes, we'll say. A lot of tribes are responding to incidents, whether it's climate change, whether it's environmental injustice. It could be other certain topics, could be other utilities that they're specifically responding to, but tribes are usually reacting and trying to adapt to a certain extent to what's going on into the world, something that we've been doing, I would say, probably for ages. And I guess with saying that, a lot of energy projects you'll see within the norm being approached from a financial perspective. And that's something that from a tribal stance really doesn't work. So I would say that every tribal energy project that we are approaching isn't from a financial standpoint. And I would say that every project that a tribe or a person should approach, should really be because it's the right thing to do. And that sounds very cliche. Everybody's probably like, oh my God, he said, because it's the right thing to do. But it's a very simple value. When we're getting into these energy projects and all of these big utilities and these big juggernauts, we talk about logging companies, we talk about mining companies. A lot of those are a means to an end in the energy world. And we have to understand kind of where we're at within that world. And so I think we're in a transition period. And so you're hearing a lot of these discussions come out about Enbridge and oil companies and clean energy, and you're kind of seeing them pitted against each other. And it's not really a good thing, but at the end of the day, we are in a transition. Clean energy is available. And again, I think if people are approaching these projects with the right intentions, not always thinking about the financial perspective, the financial incentives that are available, and thinking, oh my God, I'm going to make all this money if we do all of these renewable energy projects, you're probably approaching it from the wrong way. We need to really kind of approach a lot of these energy projects with the sense that we're fighting climate change, that it is a clean energy technology that is going to alleviate some of those air and water pollutants, and that at the end of the day, it's the right thing to do for the next 7 generations. I could probably continue to talk. I can continue to go down rabbit holes. Again, I come from a policy background, but they also highlighted that I've implemented large microgrid projects. Those projects were specifically in response to climate change events, to 500-year floods that that we experienced, and that basically cut all utilities off from the reservation. And so we have personal experience that we can draw from that says, hey, we need to absolutely get into clean energy because even existing utilities are now being affected by climate change and all of these other extreme weather events. And so there's just a lot to respond to, I guess, on this topic. And so I'll just leave it that, I have a vast background in both policy and development of large scale utilities, but I also got a little bit of background in actually implementing projects around renewable energies and other topics. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Catherine?
Ani Bonjour, Ajidekwe Indigenous Cause, Bawating and Donjba. I've been the environmental director for the Sioux Tribe since 2010, which I came on board just before the Line 6B disaster into the Kalamazoo River. And for an environmental program manager, I've been building the environmental program, which follows the model of federalism that the EPA gives us. So there's the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, and various things to protect land. So the 3 media, solid, liquid, and gas. But I also get to take on energy for some of the same reasons that Dan mentioned. I did some work long time ago for NASA when in their climate change program back in the 80s, when we couldn't call it climate change, we had to call it global tropospheric chemistry. And it's what sent me to Canada. I actually live in Canada and work on the US side and crossed a closed border for 2 years during the pandemic. In 2014, the Sioux Tribe was designated a climate action champion community by the Obama administration. So it's parallel to what Daniel was saying about 7 generation planning. Climate change is coming at us like a freight train. And if we don't have 7 generations to try and deal with this, we got to deal with it now if we're going to have 7 more generations of humanity. In addition, in 2014, the Sioux Tribe sort of became the lead tribe within the external boundaries of Michigan's territory in dealing with Line 5. Line 5 is an ancient pipeline that was put in 1953 without consultation of tribes. The threat to Line 5 at the Straits of Mackinac is enormous, and Dan could tell you much more about the threats of Line 5 to the Bad River community. But just to give you what we do in Michigan, there's Michigan, and Line 5 runs across the straits between my fingertips, 4 miles underneath the Great Lakes. And so a break there would be catastrophic, just absolutely catastrophic to freshwater intakes, to fishing, to all of our use of the lands and our relationships with the relatives who also need the land and water at the straits. So it would be disastrous. So we've been fighting it since 2014. And as part of that, I've jumped into doing a PhD on energy justice. We've all heard of environmental justice. Some have thought about climate justice. Energy justice is an interesting angle to looking at fairness with regard to energy production and use. Doing my PhD at Michigan Tech since 2018, writing energy justice for the Anishinaabe. There's two kinds of justice that are considered within energy justice. There's many kinds of justice in justice theory all the way back from Aristotle. But if you look at procedural justice, it's who gets to make decisions, whose opinions get counted, whose views matter. And then there's distributive justice, which is where the costs and benefits fall. So is it fair that we have treaty right to hunt and fish and gather at the straits, and yet an oil company could come along and destroy that? So there's a major justice issue there. But there's also benefits in the whole justice equation too, and the idea of things that people are entitled to includes energy services, and we can incorporate renewable energy into that as well. I'm also the president of Northwatch, which is Northeastern Ontario regional coalition of environmental and social justice groups. And so it's interesting to look at the differences between how energy justice issues are played out for the Anishinaabe on the south side of the medicine line versus on the north side of the medicine line. And that's all incorporated into my dissertation. So would love to talk more about all of that. I've read 108 treaties and I'm looking at the terms of the treaties and how capabilities and collective capabilities of Anishinaabe people are reflected in that, and how Anishinaabe ethics are reflected in that. Capabilities include the reproduction of culture, language, the rights to hunt, fish, and gather, of course, connection to the land, knowledge from the land, natural law based on the land, and connection to non-human relatives are all capabilities that are reflected in there and need to be incorporated in any kind of idea of energy justice for the Anishinaabe. Thank you. Miigwech.
Thank you so much all for sharing your comments. So before turning to the audience questions, I would like to start with one or two warm-up questions. Meanwhile, please submit your questions in the Q&A box. So since we have, I think, audiences with different backgrounds, so I would like to ask a little bit about the history of fossil infrastructure development and tribal lands. So what is the historical connection between tribal lands and energy development? Is energy infrastructure, including pipelines that disproportionately with on tribal lands? And if yes, what are the main, let's say, environmental challenges? So any of the panelists, please share your perspective.
If you guys can put the question into the chat, that would help me a little bit. I kind of got chopped up a little bit.
A lot of energy infrastructure is linear and it crosses a vast landscape. And so whether it's pipelines or it's transmission corridors or that sort of thing, the energy infrastructure goes a long way. So it's going to go through tribal communities, beside tribal communities, through ceded territory that tribes still retain rights on. And so it does tend to affect us tremendously. And these decisions historically have been made without proper involvement of the tribes involved.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Kathy. You know, it's hard to really describe the historical connection between tribal lands and energy development because they always went hand in hand. We can go back to, I think, what's her name? The first panelist was talking about the logging era. That was pushed by energy and perspective, energy and development, you know, to a certain extent. And what did they concentrate on? But they looked at tribal lands as potential. And you'll see it again. You go to DOE conferences, they will talk about the potential of tribal lands and how much renewable energy potential is available to the United States. In essence, you know, they're advertising our tribal lands again, similar to what they did in the logging area with just logging, you know, trying to make it this wonderful story that, you know, tribes have all of this resources. And so it definitely goes hand in hand that tribes just have the available resources on their lands. And it's always been noted that, you know, there's you know, amount of potential. And so I think contractors and developers and utilities just recognize those as opportunity, or used to recognize those as opportunity, where today we're kind of flipping the script on them, where I was talking about we're bringing back those policies, those right-of-way codes, and we're really flipping the scripts on the utilities and all of those other big juggernauts that want to use tribal lands. And so I would say right now you're seeing a transition where tribes are really emphasizing the importance of their lands and their resources, moreover than the importance of the energy infrastructure.
And to kind of expand on what Kathy and Daniel have been saying, it's not just the companies, it's not just these kinds of corporations that have always been invested in harnessing the resources that are available on tribal lands, and also ceded lands that many nations retain the right to use. It's the government itself, which has frequently throughout United States history practiced a particular form of reducing even reservation lands in pursuit of US energy projects. So a lot of the dam building that occurred, you know, kind of throughout the 20th century, but particularly during the Great Depression, a lot of that resulted in nations losing their lands to flooding because of dam construction. And the government has acted many times in many different ways, basically since the beginning of the 1800s, when it was establishing federal Indian law, federal Indian policy, that it had the right to go in and take tribal lands, ceded or unceded, and basically make use of them under the argument that it's for the common good, which is something that a lot of Indigenous peoples and activists historically and contemporarily say is really an argument that is completely ignoring Indigenous peoples and the kinds of ways that they consider the environment and resources, particularly as Daniel and Kathy pointed to in relation to future generations.
Yeah, and also the definition of common good is drastically different between the capitalist colonialist society and Indigenous communities. Indigenous communities are looking at what is best for the community, and in the capitalist colonialist society, if somebody wants to come along and make money on something, that's all they have to prove that they can do. I mean, it's generally considered for the good of society. If they make money, pay some taxes, employ some people, that's for the common good, and not looking at the downside of it. And we've got some significant differences of opinion in what constitutes common good.
And I think you hit it right on the head, Kathy. A lot of the other, we'll put the others and we'll put tribes and then others. A lot of the others are approaching everything from a financial perspective, whereas tribes are again approaching it with a seventh generation value. And so they don't ever match up. We can point to my microgrid project, which was basically, it was a resilient project. We had to emphasize resiliency. And we had contractors come in and they were like, Dan, you can increase the finances by doing this. And it's like, well, is my project still resilient? Well, you're going to lose a little bit of resilience. And it's like, well, we're not going to have it. We're pushing resilience. We're not pushing financials. And so tribes just have a different set of goals, I would say, when it comes to energy projects than the rest of the world right now. Not everybody, but most, the majority.
Thank you so much. So we have a question in the Zoom. How can energy development be aligned with restorative justice outcomes for tribal communities who have been historically most burdened by the energy system? In other words, how do we make sure that the energy decisions we make today will be beneficial for the future generations? Kathleen, do you have any comments on that?
One of the ways the tribe has been approaching it is with a lot of strategic planning, a lot of bringing in community members, a lot of community outreach, and really asking the community and tribal communities what it is that they want. And I've seen this on different levels too. I've seen this on a state level. I've seen this on the federal level. And I see it kind of being a lot of different people reaching out to tribes and saying, hey, what is it exactly you're looking for? And I can't speak for every single tribe. Each tribe is going to be unique as far as what they're pushing for as their energy profile, and whether it's energy independence, energy sovereignty. But I think really what it is making sure that there is a strategic plan in place. There has to be some community outreach, but there also has to be a strategic plan where the tribe or the municipalities have a good outlook at far as what are their goals essentially. Are we going to stay on oil and coal, and is that essentially our goal, is we're fine with kind of how that's going to play out? Or are we going to start incorporating solar? Are we going to start incorporating wind? Are we going to start investigating into all these new technologies such as hydrogen and all of these other storage capacities? And so I think it is just making sure that there's a strategic plan there for your people, making sure that there's some set of guidance, helping them, guide them along, but also telling the history part of it. There's the other part of that strategic planning too, where you have to go back and recognize, well, what got us here this far? And so doing the strategic planning forward, but also recognizing the history that's already happened would definitely help.
I spoke with a tribal leader in a First Nation in Ontario last week who described their community's wind systems. And some of the things that he was telling me were pretty exciting when you talk about how to align with justice. This particular First Nation has a wind farm on their ceded territory, which they are 50% owners in the wind farm, which is kind of exciting on a number of levels. One of the things is that when they were trying to decide what to do, they involved elders, they involved pipe carriers, they involved the fishers, they involved the knowledge keepers, and they immediately eliminated offshore wind in Lake Superior because the knowledge keepers were opposed to it. And just for that reason, no other reason than that. And they didn't have to justify it. They just said, no, they're opposed to it, so we're not going to do that. And then when they were looking at siting for towers, they had the pipe carriers go out on the land and smoke and ask the ancestors, is this appropriate? Should we be doing this? And I think that's one of the things we don't see in settler colonial engineering. We don't see, should we do this? We see a lot of how can we do this? We see what's the feasibility of this? We see the economics of this, but we don't see, should we? Is this right? This leader told me that they did get an answer back, and the answer was that it's an interim thing. It is the right thing to do right now because we need to stop digging up the fossils. And so this is the right thing to do right now, but it's just an interim thing, and think about that. The other thing that they were able to do, because this was on their ceded territory and they had cooperation from the provincial government, is that they enacted an environmental assessment act for their First Nation, and they applied it to their wind development. And it's much more stringent than the provincial or the federal environmental assessment processes where they're working. And since they applied it to their own project, now they're in a position to demand of the provincial and federal government that other types of development within the ceded territory also be subject to their Environmental Assessment Act, which is pretty exciting. And I just love the justice implications of that.
Not on this question.
So do we have any questions from the audience in the room? I have a question. As Daniel mentioned, you all represent various nations in different capacities. So I really would like to know what does energy and environmental justice like from tribal communities across the let's say I can put the question in the chat. Daniel, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I just need to get the question real quick. I didn't get that last part.
So
Ooh, yeah. And environmental justice. Oh, that's a good one. I think environmental justice is definitely I don't want to say it's a new thing because it's been kind of a discussion for a long time, especially with tribes. What is energy and environmental justice like? Again, I think you're seeing tribes in a transition where tribes can really get into the energy industry. So I'm gonna flip it a little bit and just say that right now there is major opportunity for tribes to do exactly what other utilities have been doing. And I would say as far as what it does it look like right now, it's opportunity. Tribes have the ability to regulate all the utilities that come across the reservation. They also have the opportunity to get into whole-scale markets, just like the large-scale utilities are doing. They have opportunities to get in large-scale wind, large-scale solar, large-scale energy projects in general, and for various reasons. And again, this is different for each tribe. Bad River is in a certain location where we have lots of transmission lines that run through our reservations, and we're just saying a great spot for corridors. And so we have various opportunities with working with these companies just through a regulation standpoint. As Kathy and others have mentioned, when these pipelines were put in, there was no environmental reviews ever done. There was, as far as even reaching out to homeowners and saying, hey, we're going to put this on your land, we can't even find evidence that that was ever done. So these were contractors coming in, digging in people's backyards with no authority ultimately from the tribe. And so really what you're seeing right now is tribes taking all of that authority back and putting it right in their laps, and then telling these utilities to say, hey, you're going to play ball our way, or we're not going to play ball. And you guys are just going to have to go find somewhere else to play. Or we're going to have to move on from the technologies. The other thing is transitioning. The other thing is we are trying to transition into clean energies. And so environmental justice can look different in the sense that, hey, we're going to move away from some of these dirty technologies and these dirty gases. And someone mentioned like, hey, if we get an oil spill in our region, Bad River is in a worst case scenario, we're going to lose our wild rice. And if people understand Ojibwe people and how wild rice is associated with Ojibwe people, if there's no wild rice, we essentially lose our identity as Ojibwe people in our area. And so as far as environmental justice, it can go a lot of different ways, but right now tribes are in a great spot. There's great opportunity for tribes to, one, take back what they need to, and then one, to get into a lot of these businesses that you see these utilities in.
Thank you so much. Catherine.
Yeah, EPA has a definition of environmental justice that really focuses on the costs, the implications of something. So if there is a disproportionate impact from, say, a factory on a community of color or a community in poverty, that's an environmental injustice. It's the disproportionate impact environmentally. So an exposure to bad air, bad water, whatever, something like that. Where it gets a little broader for tribal people is the idea of procedural justice. So who gets the decision-making authority? Tribes are governments, and they're not just an ethnic group. They're a government with rights and with a treaty relationship with the federal government. So you don't have a treaty relationship with, for example, the Italian community. You don't have a treaty relationship with people who are Jewish and have their Jewish community within a city. the treaty relationship is with the tribes, and the tribes need to be involved in the decision at a significant level, much more so than simply consulted. And historically, we haven't even been consulted. But the decision-making process needs to involve the tribal governments as equals to the federal government.
Thank you for your comments.
Kind of expanding on that, thinking about your question, my answer was going to be the way in which tribes are enacting their sovereignty. So kind of in a similar thought process as my co-panelists here. I'm thinking particularly about the way for my nation, White Earth, which is in north central Minnesota, how tribal sovereignty has been used, particularly in the case of Enbridge Line 3. Really when Minnesota agencies, particularly the Public Utilities Commission, which is supposed to abide by public opinion based on number of hearings, those kinds of pathways to official state agencies failed so horribly with Line 3, and how for White Earth, we really started utilizing language of tribal sovereignty, our treaty rights, but also using our own laws to enact a form of environmental justice that at the time was hoped would help protect, in particular, wild rice from Line 3 spills, but has since turned into a lawsuit against Enbridge. Particularly, White Earth passed a tribal law that provided formal recognition of wild rice's rights, particularly to exist and to flourish in spaces, including ceded spaces that we retain treaty rights to for harvest. And using that kind of traditional ecological knowledge and tribal sovereignty to really try and find our own ways of justice in a system that clearly was never going to align with, in particular, White Earth, but also other bands and nations in Minnesota, including Red Lake, for instance. They just weren't designed to actually listen to the input they were supposedly soliciting from us. It was all kind of a process that was pre-written in favor of Enbridge. So a little specificity on that, but I think tribal sovereignty here plays such an important role in environmental justice.
So much. So we have a couple of questions. Q&A box. So the first one is, what kinds of novel ownership structures have you seen in terms of energy development or infrastructure that allow indigenous groups to have more autonomy over energy decisions and outcomes on their lands?
The novel ownership structures have me a little thrown off a little bit, especially with tribes. We get into ownership and who owns what, it can get into a sticky conversation. So I'm gonna attempt to ask. I would say as tribes have more authority over the ownership, or as we own, more of our land and more of our bases, and more of our infrastructure, there becomes a responsibility to make sure that infrastructure is one operational, is one what the people want and need, and then 3 is really addressing the goals that the tribe intended. The autonomy over energy decisions and outcomes is where you're kind of throwing me off a little bit, because I feel tribes don't necessarily have to own things to necessarily have that autonomy over energy decisions and outcomes on their land. And I think Kathy kind of pointed to it previously, is we have these treaties set in place which gives us our rights to have this autonomy over energy decisions and outcomes on our lands. And so we have our reservation lands, but then there's the Midwest tribes, which we have our treaty lands. And so we have a set of responsibilities to not only oversee our responsibilities on the reservation, but also off the reservation. And so that's where your ownership structures are kind of throwing me off a little bit, is we don't have to technically own Wisconsin to sit there and say, hey, we don't want this in northern Wisconsin. We, as a tribe, we have treaty rights that already say we can do that. So I'm going to say that right now we're exercising those treaty rights. And I will say that we are coming more accustomed to starting to comment and make sure that these projects, even outside of the reservation, are what tribes and communities needs. And I'll say that it's not just tribes, we're clumping tribes together here. And that's a scary thought, because you end up pitting tribes against companies, and that you don't want that. And so really we have to be, it's northern Wisconsin. You look at northern Wisconsin, it's not just tribes. There's a lot of grassroots groups that are also against a lot of these companies and how they've been operating on northern Wisconsin. And so we don't necessarily have to be owners. We can be partners, we can be stakeholders. We can just live here. And I think that's where it's like, hey, we all got our duties as human beings. And I don't want to get too cliche again, but we all have our responsibilities to make sure what's happening in our backyard is right for our people. And so we don't have to own it to necessarily have that autonomy, I think.
Interesting points. Thank you.
I would like to jump in on that, because there are some interesting structures that I think could be explored more. One of our MTerra board members, MTerra member group, has their own tribal utility, and they structured this to buy power and sell it to through a substation. They realized that if they put up their own utility in the substation of their own, they could do it more economically than to buy power through their own substation and not have their own utility. And so it makes it very interesting, because utilities within the exterior boundaries of the state of Michigan are subject to regulation by the Michigan Public Service Commission. But the state of Michigan does not control what happens on tribal land. That's a federal issue, federal responsibility. And so it kind of makes you jump in with the question of why does the state of Michigan, through its Michigan Public Service Commission, have the right to make decisions about energy infrastructure that is on ceded territory where tribes have rights? So there's a question there, and it really came to a head April 2020. We're all in lockdown from the pandemic. I couldn't get across the border to my own desk, and Enbridge dropped hundreds of pages of applications for a tunnel project across the Straits of Mackinac through Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, through U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and through Michigan Public Service Commission. And that made us wonder, why does the Michigan Public Service Commission have decision-making authority here by itself? Why does it get to decide about issues that relate to lands that it does not control and that we have shared responsibility for? We literally have a consent decree that says we are shared managers of the fishery at the Straits with the state of Michigan, lodged in federal court. And so why don't we have an Aboriginal Public Service Commission that could also consider such proposals and permit applications, in addition to a state public service commission? I think there might be room to do something there, because we've started the process with tribal utilities, and I think that that's a logical next step.
Thank you so much. Comments. Sasha, would you like to add? So let's move to the next question. We're talking about opportunity for lots of First Nations, but how equitable is this opportunity across the board? Is this easily accessible knowledge or even policy? Are these resources accessible to less informed folks on energy and tribal land rights?
We had this question, and not this question, but we had a question about how do people approach tribes and get them to the tables or get them to talk about some of these topics. And it's a very, very similar thing, is that there is a tribe in almost every person's backyard. And so as far as tribal knowledge and how accessible it is you don't really usually have to go too far to find it within your area. For Midwest, you can find an Ojibwe nation almost every 60 miles from each other. And it's kind of weird. It's like we set it up that way to a certain extent. We did. So I mean, but the point is this knowledge is available. You just have to reach out to tribes. That we had a federal agency, like, how do we reach out to tribes? Like, what is the best way to reach out from tribes? And I'd be like, well, how do you call your parents? How do you call your friends? Email works too. And a lot of us tribal members, as you can see with the way I just talked, we love to talk. We love to share the information we have, and we're more than happy to usually be brought to the table and working groups and just be involved. And I think Kathy said tribes just need to be involved quicker and sooner and more earlier into the conversation, and the knowledge would just be there in front of you. And so I think with saying that is just invite us, look at where the tribes lie within the United States, find the nearest tribal nation that's next to you and reach out to them, go visit them. They're usually fairly friendly people.
Yeah, I mean, you just have to go past the land acknowledgement. Some of us listen to land acknowledgements and kind of roll our eyes because it's usually followed up with, well, how do we even reach out to tribes? It's just like Dan said, pick up the phone. We exist and we're here and we're doing good work, and you can find us as easily as you can find your city council member and your local office of your state legislator. We're in the phone book.
And I'll say it just finally, just approach with respect. I think is the other thing is, as long as you're approaching with respect and good intent, we're always, I think, going to be available to provide what information we have. We'll be a little hesitant at times. We're going to question what your guys' intentions are. But I think at the end of the day, if you're coming with that the good feelings, the good intent, and you have good reasoning, we're going to come to the table and we're going to help out, and we'll share the accessible knowledge, or the policies. Those are usually public anyways to a certain extent, so we can just usually hand those over as well.
Yeah, I mean, tribes are pretty accessible, particularly, tribal websites offer a lot of contact information specifically to, people who are running programs versus other individuals. So there are lots of resources available that tribes themselves give out, both to contact tribes, to establish relationships, but just to kind of reiterate what Daniel said there, coming with respect and knowing that in some situations, tribal nations may choose that this isn't the moment for a specific kind of conversation, and respecting where particular kinds of cultural knowledge may be closed practice and not something that tribal nations are going to share, and finding ways to work without the assumption that tribes owe people things, and that the relationship starting from respect is what creates a good balanced conversation that brings tribes in a good way.
Thank you.
I would like to point out something that needs to be said about consent. under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, there's an expression, free, prior, informed consent. And the governments of Turtle Island have a difficult time with that last word, consent. They have actually defined free and prior and informed. And in fact, the US federal government said consent means not necessarily agreement. And I think if you think about consent in any other context, you realize that it does mean agreement. You can't take me out on a date and then tell me everything that you'd like to do and then ask whether I agree or not. And if I say no, just go ahead and do it anyway. That's not consent. And it's the same among tribal governments. You have to, when you're approaching anybody with respect, a no has to be accepted as a no. And if your process doesn't provide for the possibility of a no, then it's not going to be consent that you've achieved.
And there's a first part to the question too. They talk about, but how equitable is this opportunity across the board? The way tribes are staggered, there's 500 and some tribes across the United States. If I made a joke the other day, I said, imagine if the federal government would give tribes money and allow us to distribute those funds to states. Everybody got a good laugh at that. But imagine if you did, imagine if you put those funds instead of 50 states, if you put that into 500 and some tribes, and then those resources were distributed into the municipalities within that area and that, or the service area within that tribe. And I guess what I'm saying is tribes don't necessarily stick to their boundaries. Like Kathy said, we kind of tribes have gotten over that land boundary a long time ago, and we've started recognizing our treaty rights a long time ago. And so we don't necessarily use that land boundary all the time. And so when we talk about equitability, especially with the energy world, everything is interconnected. Everything almost energy, whether it's electrical, oil, there's these massive systems where they're interconnected. And so if you have a tribe that is doing big things in your neighborhood, guess what? You're being exposed to big things as well. Your energy infrastructure is, participating in big things. Not only that, is you're bringing those big contractors into the area, and they're going to be available to you as well. And so with tribes doing projects like this, we're kind of exposing not just tribes, but our surrounding areas to a lot of these technologies and making it available. So we don't think of it as, oh, it's on the tribe, it's closed off and it's just for us. No, we try to share that experience, and we try to share that technology and that knowledge. And well,
Thank you so much. Okay, so we have another question in the Zoom. I am familiar with the ethical short-sightedness of capitalistic short-termism and the corrective ethical wisdom of seventh generation thinking. I have recently learned of the even longer frame of like-termism as a relatively new philosophical ethical perspective. Do any of the panelists have a familiarity and thoughts about the long-termism as it relates to indigenous thoughts and energy justice?
Yeah. First of all, seventh generation thinking is an expression that gives you something that you can wrap your head around. But indigenous frames of knowing are much, much longer than that. There is the rules and the laws are based on the land, and natural law, and what the land accepts and what the land does not accept. And that is far, far, far longer than 7 generations. The important thing I think to understand is that the land is its own entity, and it has agency, and it has the right to self-determination. And the land needs to be respected for that. The idea that we can own land is bizarre. I mean, I might live 70 or 80 years. The land has been there forever and will be there forever. It owns itself, and it has the right to. And so the question about what we should do or shouldn't do, it's a very, very long-term frame of mind when you're looking at what the land accepts and what the land wants.
Thank you so much, Daniel and Sasha.
Yeah, no, I think Kathy did a great job. Seventh generation, we got to be careful of trying to on how we define that. And I think Kathy did a great job. It's definitely longer than seventh generation, and it has much deeper meaning than just making sure it's there for our children. That's part of it, you know. And I think Kathy really emphasized on the bigger part of it is, you know, making sure that this stuff is available for eternity. You know, essentially, it's not just for our children, but it's for our children's children and so on. And so the seventh generation actually has, you know, this infinite type I don't know what you want to call it, rhetoric. And so I know you want to put long-termism as a relatively relatable philosophy, and I'll say it is. It's nice that people are coming around and thinking more about than just today, because there is, even today, we have people that still think about what's good for now and not what's good for tomorrow. So I think it's a great thought that's coming in, but still, I think the seventh generation, you have to really get into what those teachings are, and what Kathy kind of emphasized on it. It goes beyond those seventh generation, and it's more about making sure that land, everything is usable forever, not just now, not just for my children's children. We want my children's children to understand that they need to make it even better than what we're doing today. And so you think of that, you think of how can your children make it better than what we're doing right now, because our philosophy is it's only going to get worse. And so seventh generation has a totally different ideology than I think even long-termism, if that makes sense.
So I'm not familiar with long-termism specifically, but kind of thinking about the conversation that's playing out, and really honing in on the fact that, like Kathy said, we don't own the land owns itself, and it's about what the land will tolerate and what the land needs. And part of that also, in terms of thinking, you know, in a scope of not even just 7 generations, but for human beings, native, non-native, over, you know, human history and human future, the ways in which we interact with land itself, for many native nations, for many different native cultures, is a process of acknowledging that you yourself are responsible to the land because you rely upon that land. And for you to continue to exist, for futures to continue to exist, you need to abide by that kind of reciprocal understanding that land itself and other creations on it are not necessarily things that you can own or control, that you are part of one of a much larger ecosystem. And that really frames a lot of how Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge operates in a way that I think is very hard for people who have been trained predominantly in Western intellectual thought to comprehend. There's some major things that come with that kind of thinking that really also help us rethink the idea of time itself.
Very cool. One more question in this room. Last question. This might be a loaded question, but moving towards an equitable energy transition, what gaps do you see on a regulatory and policy level, especially as it relates to tribal relationships with PUCs, PSCs, the Department of Energy, and other federal and state entities?
Kathy answered this a little bit in her other statement with PSCs. And really, there's just a gap of recognizing tribes as on a federal level. You know, we are not a state. We are bigger than a state. The thought is bigger than a state. You know, we are essentially our own little country. And I think, you know, we need to be approached that way as far as being at the table. And again, you know, there's opportunity in that. And so you know, I say that with all good intentions. And I say that as I'm almost trying to sell tribes, and I got to be careful because I only speak for Bad River, but there's opportunity with partnering with tribes and making these gaps, you know, addressing a lot of these gaps, because you'll see these gaps aren't just on tribal lands. A majority are, but there is gaps that overlap between tribal lands and the neighboring municipalities or the state that they're residing in. Normally, if your energy or your like, let's just say electricity, if your electricity is bad on the reservation, it's probably bad in the surrounding municipalities. And so, you know, if you bring tribes in, we address tribes as a stakeholder and a partner, something bigger than a state level. I think you're going to see a different approach to how these energy projects are started and completed. And you're going to see a lot of those areas that are receiving injustice, we'll say energy injustice. You'll see a lot of those areas start getting addressed, especially with those gaps. As far as what gaps do you see? We're still reliant on old technologies, where you're still seeing coal being talked about to a certain extent. You're still seeing oil being addressed as a big player in the game, providing all of these resources to the United States and to the tribes and states. And I think a lot of that information that is being put out there is somewhat falsified, and it's making us hang on to a technology that is becoming somewhat obsolete. Like, honestly, clean energies are coming, and they are coming fast. And I think it scares people. And I think you're seeing somewhat, if people remember the 90s and when coal was going out and natural gas was coming in, there were people standing by coal and saying natural gas was not it. And now look at natural gas. Not to say natural gas is the best thing in the world, but look at it. And so we're seeing some of the same things where people are seeing this technology at their doorstep. Like, everybody has something solar. You go to your house, someone has a solar something. They do. Even if you don't think you do, you'll find some. And so solar is around the corner. All of these technologies are becoming available to everybody, even the common resident. And so I think the transition is awesome. I think gaps are definitely being highlighted on a different level. You're seeing that utilities that are charging these rates aren't necessarily up to par. Their infrastructure is not this brand new infrastructure. Most of this infrastructure came in the 1960s, and a lot of it hasn't been updated across the board. You know, like, it's not just on tribes, but across the board, a lot of this infrastructure has not been updated. And so from a regulatory and policy level, we need to bring tribes up. And then I think as you bring tribes up, you're going to bring all those environmental issues and gaps to the table, and they're going to not necessarily iron themselves out, but they will be addressed and talked about.
Thank you so much. Catherine, we have about 2 minutes to wrap up the.
Okay, I'll be quick. 2 points. I just read an article about how young people are not going into jobs in the fossil fuel industry, and banks and insurance companies are not lending and insuring fossil fuel developments any longer. Yet we still have Office of Fossil Fuel Programs in the Department of Energy. This is a huge problem. We needed to stop that like 30 years ago, but we definitely need to stop it now. There should not be any further taxpayer investment in the fossil fuel industry. The other one I wanted to say is that our regulatory structures are not designed to accept no. Our regulatory structures are too often designed to say, how do we mitigate the objections here? How do we work around the objections here? How do we get to consent from everybody who has an issue around something? And I think at some point we have to recognize that that's not how we make good decisions. Sometimes the answer is simply no. We are all in relationships where there's 2 yeses, 1 no rules. And it's time that we had 2 yeses, 1 no rule on fossil fuel developments. Just wanted to say that, you know, sometimes no just means no.
Thank you so much. Do you have any comments?
Yeah, just really quickly, I think it was maybe Daniel who was talking about like building relationships and kind of building on Kathy's point of bringing, you know, tribes to the table, particularly in states like Minnesota and Wisconsin. States are already doing this in other ways through Public Law 280, which has been around since the 1950s. And if states can do that in relation to things like reservations, providing education to people who live in border towns, or providing access to different kinds of resources. It can be done in other situations as well, including energy. And I think that states themselves could really reconsider their own relationships, particularly around energy production itself, and how their relationships with tribes exist outside of this particular issue.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for having us, and special thanks to Kathleen, Sasha, and Daniel.
Thank you, Parisa, and yeah, thanks to our panelists. Thank you all for joining us here in person and online. Reminder that we'll be having our next forum November 29th on energy career pathways. So apologize for any of the technical difficulties in the audio. We'll hopefully iron those out in time for our next forum. I hope to see many of you either in person or online in 4 weeks. Thank you.